So welcome panelists, and thank you to our previous presenters. So much of today is all about all the ways everyone can serve. And during the panel, we're going to discuss more dimensions of the question, how do we value the time that we spend serving? My name is Stanley Fontaine, and I'm delighted to serve as a moderator. I'm a former educator and now work at the Annie Casey Foundation. And service has been a through line in my life. I started volunteering in middle school at a local YMCA and the Early Childhood Center. More recently, I volunteered at a Teen Financial Literacy Summit. So really the question of how do we value service has always resonated with me. I'd like to start by giving our panelists a chance to introduce themselves with a simple question. What is your service story?
I guess I'm next. So good afternoon, good morning, everybody. I'm Jeff Moore. I am the Chief Strategy Officer at Independent Sector, and we will have the chance to talk a little bit, or maybe more than a little bit, about the value of volunteer time. Like we've heard this morning, I think it's also been true for me in my life that the whole concept of service has really begun at home. I remember, I think I was about 6th grade, and I watched my parents volunteer, mostly through church, and nothing big, fancy. It might have been delivering a meal or driving for Meals on Wheels. And I remember asking my parents at one point, why do you do this? Why do you center this in your life? And the response was, it's one of those few things that makes you bigger than yourself. And I thought, I'm in 6th grade. I have no idea what that means. That's parent speak. And so, I fast forward 40 or so years, and sitting as a volunteer on the board of an independent sector member, Blue Path Service Dogs, provide service dogs trained to help families with children with autism. And I was at a graduation ceremony when we were graduating dogs up to their forever families, and the mom in this particular family said, you all have made it possible for my son's world to get bigger. And I thought, that's what they were talking about.
I can't beat that, so I won't try. Well, my name's Nathan Dietz. I'm the research director at the Do Good Institute, which is in the School of Public Policy at the University of Maryland. I think to start with, my service story begins at home. Probably like a lot of people, the scope could not be smaller. I would watch my mom bring all the neighborhood kids over so that we could all play and she could watch over everybody. That was great for her. She loved doing it, so it was a service that was valuable to the volunteer. It was great for the kids. It wasn't great for me always because I kind of wondered, when is my mom going to spend time with me? Why is she spending time with everybody else? But that's part of the story. I think service is about that. Later on, fast forwarding many years as I grew up, I think my work with volunteering and service is really about working with people who facilitate it, who make it all possible. The point in my life where I started spending a lot of time doing that was when I started working for the agency that's now called AmeriCorps. It used to be called the Corporation for National and Community Service. Thank you. Deserves a round of applause. Doing a lot of work for and with people who supported volunteer and service programs nationwide. Doing a lot of research on volunteering that got a lot of national attention, and making everybody aware of how prevalent volunteering was, how much variety there was in volunteering in America, and how important it was to so many people in organizations, in communities, and in the hearts of the people who provided the service. I'm lucky enough to continue to do that work, and I'm glad that I have a chance to work for good every day. Thank you. Antonio?
Proud that it's at the University of Maryland, my alma mater.
Yes, we're proud.
So for me, I just want to thank Independent Sector for allowing me the privilege of being up on this stage and the work that they do. And as somebody that runs a nonprofit, just very grateful to Akila and Michael and the team, and Jeff, of course. So for me, it really hit home when I was at the swearing-in ceremony to get my citizenship with my mom, who had married an American guy. And she would almost exaggerate her version of being an American to try to belong, to try to fit in. And this is an important moment for a lot of immigrants that are able to demonstrate their value to America through volunteerism. And we can talk a little later about how that's being curtailed by some of these policies that don't make you feel safe, even leaving your home. But for now, I remember my mom talking about how whatever, we weren't born into this. This is a privilege. It's not a right. And if you're, whatever it is that America gives you, you need to pay it back tenfold. That stayed with me and at this moment, and she was wearing something very ridiculous in terms of a hat that had like the flag on it and a shirt that said, you know, a proud American, and she really was like kissing the linoleum, and I had grown up here, so I didn't quite have the same immigrant experience she did, even though I was in my late 20s and I was suddenly an American. But I've passed that on to my kids, where every one of them has been volunteering from the time that they were born. Like in the baby Bjorn, we were volunteering as a family, and they were a part of it. That came full circle when I looked at two of my kids' applications for college, and when they were talking about what distinguished them and what was part of their identity. All the things that they used to roll their eyes and complain about because it was cold and we were outside feeding people and everything else, it all showed up. So that value was there in terms of service. And I've always told them that if you want to see the best version of yourself, don't look in a mirror. Look to someone that needs your help.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing those stories. And Antonio, I can relate to that as a son of immigrants as well. This week is especially exciting as the independent sector and the Do-Good Institute have released this year's Value of Volunteer Time report. I'd like to invite Nathan and Jeff to share a little bit more about this newest resource. And then I'd love to hear from Antonio as well.
Yeah, thank you. Well, the release happened on Tuesday. I think the 2025 value of volunteer time per hour is $36.14. That's up, I'm reading off the page here, even though I don't have it committed to memory yet. Right, with that too. That's up from $34.79 in 2024, and that's a 3.9% increase from the previous year. That's a larger increase than we saw just with price inflation in general. So that gives you a sense that the value of volunteering is increasing more in people's eyes than inflation is. And that's not quite right, though, because of the way that the value is calculated. You know, the value is calculated based on a certain set of assumptions about how we should place value on the volunteer work that people do. The values come from the Bureau of Labor Statistics' current economic survey, and which is a monthly survey of organizations. They collect data from 119,000 organizations, representing 622,000 work sites on average per month. And they get the average wage of the people who are working there from those firms. And they publish monthly numbers that they adjust over the course of the year. They publish a final number at the end of the year. The final number for 2025 is actually not available yet. So we published interim numbers that are very close. Oh, thanks. And that's where the 36, thank you. That's where the 3614 comes from. So the thing about the estimates is that it represents the value to an organization of having a volunteer do that hour's worth of work, as opposed to having them have to pay an employee to do that hour's worth of work. You know, and the assumption there nationwide is that the amount of volunteer time that people contribute to organizations throughout the country is pretty similar to the amount of paid work that people contribute to organizations throughout the country, because the percentage, in other words, the percentage of types of work that people are doing in the volunteer workforce has to be the same for this to work as the type of work that people are doing in the paid labor force. So that's one assumption that we're making. We're also saying that we're also talking about what we're not measuring when we calculate the value of volunteer work this way. We're not talking about the value of, or the opportunity cost to someone who volunteers as opposed to working an extra hour for pay. And the difference here, if you think about somebody who's maybe an accountant for a living, he does works in an accounting job, if they volunteer with an organization and they say work at a food bank, putting food on plates and getting them ready for delivery, on the one hand, the value to the organization is the value of the work that the accountant is doing. It's not the value, obviously, of the accountant's time, because if he were spending it doing accounting, that time would be worth a lot more. So, if you think about it that way, it's kind of hard to, you might disagree with the way that we're placing value on volunteering, but it makes sense to a lot of organizations, I think, because it's commonly used. The other thing that we're not, and I know that Jeff is going to talk more about this, the other thing that we're not doing at all when we value volunteer time this way is placing value on the service that volunteers provide to the people who actually benefit. There's a way to do that. We're not trying to do that at all, and that's obviously going to be part of the story. And it's really important that, there we go again, sorry. It's really important to keep that in mind as a limitation of this number, because as we've been talking about, there are people who benefit directly from the service that volunteers provide. Organizations benefit from having volunteers around. Volunteers themselves benefit from the warm glow that they get from doing good. And you can say the communities benefit over and above the institutions and the people who live there, because volunteering makes a place better. We don't value any of that when we use this dollar estimate, but to some extent it does represent all the benefits that volunteering brings to communities.
Thanks, Nathan. And I really do want, on behalf of Independent Sector, to thank the Do Good Institute for the extraordinary partnership. You all do the work of calculating the number. We get to put it up on the website for Independent Sector. And interestingly enough, 3614, it's just a number. And it's a lot more than a number. And it also happens to be the single most visited page on the Independent Sector website, which is quite an extraordinary thing and not a new phenomenon. So, a couple of things that I would say about how it's more than a number. And we do at IAS pay a lot of attention to numbers and data. And one of the reasons we do that is because they help us tell a story, right? So at the end of the day, there are a lot of ways in which this number, 3614, is used, right? Including by corporate entities who look to calculate, for tax purposes, the value of the volunteer time that their staff are putting into particular projects, right? That's one very real use. But the other is to be able to go up to Capitol Hill, which we do a lot of, and to be able to say, this is what volunteers, and oh, by the way, we at Independent Sector talk about volunteers as one of the 3 legs of the nonprofit workforce. There's the volunteer force, there's the stipended workforce, and there's the fully employed paid workforce. And this is what that first leg is contributing to the American economy. I don't know how many of you watched the NewsHour, but there was an extraordinary story by Judy Woodruff about 2 weeks ago when she was really focusing in on the question of volunteerism and the value of volunteerism. And this just blew my mind, that about 40% or 50% of the firefighter force in this country is volunteer. And the value of that time each year is about $50 billion out of a total of about $120 billion with a B value contributed by volunteers across the country in all of sectors. That is just an incredibly powerful, powerful story. So 3614. One of the things that we're also excited about through the work with Nathan and the Do Good Institute, and this is work that will come in the next couple of years, is the ability to actually start slicing the data by volunteer type so that we can say, we already slice it by state. So you may have seen on LinkedIn, right, there are numbers popping up, the value in Virginia, the value in Maryland. And one of the things we look to be able to do in the future is to be able to say, this is what the value of somebody who's coming as a volunteer CFO to work in your organization, this is what that is worth. So that's in the future. And again, just our great thanks to Nathan and Do Good for being able to put this data point out in the world because it helps us tell a story.
Thank you. And Tony?
Duke Ellington, who was from Washington, D.C., once said that music is what happens between the notes. So I do think there's a lot that happens between the numbers when it comes to data. I think of the opportunities that you provide through volunteerism to further someone's career, to have them network. It's not just complete altruism. There's an actual opportunity for you to, for instance, when I was young, I was volunteering with the Whitman Walker Clinic here in Washington, D.C. During an absolute crisis and epidemic, not just for this area, for the country. And that was the first time that I ever wrote a speech, and it was for Tipper Gore, who was speaking at AIDS Walk that year. And it was only because they didn't have anybody else, and I happened to be a journalism major, and I said I would do it. It was terrible, and they redid it completely. But it gave me the chance to do the next one. I also volunteered at an early time of my career at the Darrell Green Youth Life Center, if anybody remembers their great work here. And so many opportunities came up in terms of my communications career, doing prep, doing messaging, writing, and I had all of these samples that I wouldn't have had. Even though I was doing it for the right reasons, there were benefits to it. So that would be interesting to be able to capture in terms of workforce development, in terms of personal development, because those are values, very valuable aspects that you need for your career, and also, of course, the impact that you're making on the community.
Yeah, I appreciate the points of view. I want to invite a conversation that leads into a broader interpretation of the word value. How else should people be thinking about valuing generosity and giving back? What other connections are there to be made? Antonia, I'll be glad to start with you first.
I think I talked a little bit about it already in terms of at the beginning when I was talking about the value proposition that you want to present to America, especially as an immigrant, especially at this moment when one can feel very helpless in these moments. I got back from the Twin Cities in Minnesota, where we led a delegation of leadership over there to support what was going on the ground. And it was one of those moments when you see people that feel helpless, but you never want someone to feel hopeless. Being able to do something, to have some sort of an action, instead of just watching it happen, there is an activation that happens within you that I think is extremely, extremely valuable. So when I think of those values that you get from the value of volunteerism, there is that aspect of not feeling helpless at a time that a whole lot of folks feel helpless right now. It makes you an active participant, that you're part of making an impact. In other ways, it's really important that we look at the next 250 years in terms of service. It has to include immigrants and young people. You look at the demographics of the country, it is now flat or declining, and you need that boost. That also means that there'll be a decline in volunteerism, in community impact, and in every other area. When I look at Generation Alpha, which I have 2 kids that are Generation Alpha, even though I'm really old, I know you're all looking at me that way. You're looking at me like he is Latino. He had young kids at an old age. But Generation Alpha, I saw the statistic that 8 out of 10 said that they have volunteered. We need to continue to encourage young people to make that impact. And I was saying earlier, this moment of wanting to have some sort of a say in where our country goes, the easiest way to do that is to start and think about the power that you have when you're walking through a park and there's a piece of garbage on the floor and you're able to pick that up and put it somewhere. All of it counts. All of it is a measure of privilege that you're able to bend over and pick up that piece of garbage and put it somewhere. And it's really important that we're able to exercise that as Americans.
I'm happy to share two additional thoughts about some of the value that volunteerism brings beyond the value that we just talked about in a number. One of the things, and I think we saw it, on tremendous display in the panels this morning, especially from our young rising leaders, is that volunteerism provides an incredibly important pipeline into the nonprofit workforce, moving from early on volunteerism into careers in the nonprofit and philanthropic space. We shouldn't underestimate that. Unfortunately, I do not have a data point in my mind as to what percentage of that volunteer force eventually migrates, if you will, into the workforce, but it is significant, and they're some of the most talented people that we are growing in the nonprofit workforce. So that's one, pipeline. The other is a point that Akila mentioned earlier, and it's a point about trust. At Independent Sector, we spend a lot of time thinking about public trust in nonprofits and philanthropy, and we measure that trust annually in partnership with Edelman Data and Intelligence. And in fact, that survey, which is the largest survey that's done in the country, is in the field right now, and in June we will be releasing the trust numbers, public trust. And if you think about it, trust is the most critical currency that we hold as charitable nonprofit organizations. There is nothing that we currently do that if we do not have public trust, it becomes harder, if not impossible. We can't raise money. We can't recruit volunteers or employees. And most importantly, perhaps, it becomes a whole heck of a lot harder to come into a community and stand alongside a community to do really hard systemic change work. One of the ways that we build trust, including trust in charitable nonprofit organizations, is through volunteerism. It's all about proximity. It's the formula. That's the formula. You come in, you work alongside folks in a nonprofit organization, and your trust in that organization, and we would hope in institutions more largely, grows. And so that is another tremendous, but maybe not the first thing you think about when you think about the value of volunteerism, but it's about trust.
I agree. It is about trust, and as I think about this question, I think that this is an opportunity to talk about why the value of an hour of volunteer time is not necessarily created equal across contexts and across circumstances. I think it matters a lot, first of all, if it's a young person who's doing that volunteering, because people have talked about this before earlier today, especially on the last panel, but young people, if you can get them started and get them into the volunteer workforce, especially doing volunteer work through an organization, then you can put them on a lifetime of service that will make it easier for them to just capitalize on any opportunities that come by afterward. I love hearing your stat, Tony, about 8 out of 10 Generation Alpha members done some volunteer work. I would be surprised if that was limited to volunteering through or for an organization. It's probably just doing Oh, it is really?
No, it's not. It is
Okay.
just doing any kind of volunteerism.
Gotcha. Okay.
Public service.
Then, that's, I think, a part of the theme that we've heard already is that the seed is there, the motivation is there. No one needs to do much to encourage it. What we need to do is help young people get through the doors, get past the barriers that prevent people from seeing any value in young people providing volunteer work. So that's one. Young people volunteering is much more valuable, I think, for all of us than just a regular old hour of service is. The other way in which volunteer work is more valuable is if people do it together, and that's what you were talking about. The people who talk about the sense of belonging and how important that is to not just motivating volunteering, but encouraging people to continue doing it once they've had once they've been exposed to it. That's really important. I think we published a report, the Do Good Institute did, for the Generosity Commission, trying to figure out what the mechanisms might look like to encourage more volunteering. It turns out that it's the same mechanisms that Robert Putnam talked about 25, 30 years ago in Bowling Alone are the same ones that are most effective in encouraging volunteering. It's involvement with organized groups. So not involvement with family activities, not just interactions with your neighbors, but interactions with organized groups of people who get together for almost any reason. It doesn't really matter what the purpose is. The point is getting together with people and doing things as a group helps people realize the value of doing volunteer work on your own. And if you do volunteer work with a group, then you're doubling the impact of the type of benefits that everybody realizes from volunteering.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. And some of the things you guys referenced, lifting up the pipeline, I think that's extremely important. As someone who volunteered in middle school in an early child care class, I think that maybe was a big part of why I wanted to go into education and serve as an educator. So that resonated with me. And also when you talk about the relationships that you get to build while you're volunteering, I think that with me at the foundation, the relationships I was able to build with people I work with, I got to know them a lot more while we were volunteering together than the day-to-day meetings we had. As we're nearing the close, I want to lean into the frame of today's symposium and the significance of this year. As we celebrate our country's 250th birthday, there's a lot of focus on the future. What are your parting thoughts for how nonprofits, philanthropies, educators, community leaders, and all of us as individuals can support a future where volunteering is celebrated and valued even more?
So again, I'm going to reference the piece that Judy Woodruff did a couple of weeks ago and talked about how important it is to go back to the beginning in order to think about how we go forward. And I don't mean to be cute, and I don't mean to be political, and I am paraphrasing what she said. But if you think about it, the beginning, 250 years ago, we didn't need a king, and we didn't want a king to tell us how to come together as community to get really hard things done. We needed that sense of independence, right, which to this day remains essential to the work of the charitable nonprofit sector. We are an independent sector. We are independent of government. We are independent of the market, though we are in deep relationship with both. So I think it's super important as we think about the next 250 and we think about what it is that the individual can do, is that the individual holds extraordinary power, and we always have. We didn't need, and we don't need, somebody to tell us, these are the parameters that you can work within. No, we can actually step forward and begin to solve a problem on our own in partnership with those in community. That's what makes volunteerism roll. It's always been true. It's always going to be true.
As I think about this, parting thoughts, I've got a couple. I think I'll try to make them both fairly short because I'm really tempted by the idea of the magic wand that was at the end of the last panel. If I had a magic wand, I would wave it so that every nonprofit and community organization's leader could immediately recognize all the value that volunteers bring to the organization, to the volunteers, to the community at large, without having to do any extra work. I think that's and I want to emphasize that because that's always part of the problem with trying to gather data on volunteering, is because somebody has to collect all the data and validate it and then report it back so that people can analyze it, people like me. And in a sense, you know, you need to do a lot of work to justify that request, because there's a tremendous amount of work. And I'm not going to make that request, but I do think that if organization leaders just spend time reflecting on the value that they see, on the value that volunteers provide in all kinds of different ways, then they would realize how important it is for us to have a sense of how much value volunteerism provides nationwide. So I'd like to reduce the burden down to zero so that we could, everybody's job could be made a lot easier when it comes to recognizing the value of all this. The other parting thought is the role of higher education, and I think I've been asked to talk about that. It makes sense for me, working at the Do Good Institute at the University of Maryland. Our job is to try to train students in social entrepreneurship. What we do, like we did last night, some of our students become social entrepreneurs themselves. They create these fantastic organizations that make tremendous impact. I have no idea where the energy and the intuition and the ingenuity comes from to actually create these enterprises and do the work that they do. But those are they're the tip of the iceberg. They're way out in the tail of accomplishments that our students are providing. We also want to train students to think entrepreneurially about social problems, to look for ways to address community problems, to find the people who could help, that would work well with you, to try to look for ways around barriers that might make the obvious solution infeasible. Those are the types of things that even if you don't create your own organization, you can learn how to do once you finish college, and we want to give you the skills that you would need to actually take advantage of those opportunities. It'll make you a better employee if you know how to do this. It'll make you a better citizen, a better neighbor, a better family member, and more of an asset to everybody you come into contact with.
What I would like to see is community problems solved by the community. There are too many times that someone thinks they know what's best for our communities. And that isn't always reflected when you talk about a pipeline. We need a pipeline of somebody that is of Haitian descent running an organization serving the Haitian community in Miami or wherever it might be. So many times that I sit in front of folks, well-meaning folks, by the way, and I look out into who the nonprofit leadership is, and then they don't necessarily reflect the communities that they serve. I watched someone very close to me deliver 3 babies. I empathize. I felt what they felt, but I didn't know what they went through. I'm not a woman. I've never delivered a baby. No matter how empathetic, no matter how much support I was trying to give, I don't know what it's like to be a woman, sacrifice your body, emotions, everything, and deliver that baby. When we went to Minnesota, which I mentioned a moment ago, as national leaders, a lot of times you're coming in there with a different point of view. But that point of view needs to start with how they're handling things. What is their rapid response that's different in Minnesota than it would be in California or in Texas and in other areas in North Carolina? It's the same thing when we look at some of our communities. So that's one area that I would like to see in the next 250 years, a true reflection of the communities being served by someone from that community serving, and everyone else can help. But there is that nuance that we need to have. The other one is going back to youth, to see innovation in volunteerism. It's wonderful, and I've said this to my own children, it's wonderful to go and pack food and do all those things. But think of a different way of packing the food or accessing that food or growing that food or helping people learn how to cook that food that's healthier. How can you innovate the delivery system of food, for instance? And because I think the panel before us was talking about food insecurity. We had a program where we worked, and it wasn't even a large grant that we were doing with Kroger, and it was like $10,000 that we gave to a bunch of young people in Houston. They bought a farm somewhere in Houston. First of all, it makes me feel like I could be a farm owner. But and that farm, they've ended up serving like 5,000 people a month that are now coming there and growing food, and have come up with a different way of delivering food, including with schools. They're now delivering food to schools that are then being provided as ancillary meals to young people. So the innovation of young people, and think about this too, a 15-year-old with access to Wi-Fi and a device can reach more people in a split second than Martin Luther King, Gandhi, and Dolores Huerta could in a lifetime combined. That's power. And to be able to come up to someone and say, what is your point of view? Stop telling young people they're a leader of the future or tomorrow's leader. Not with that kind of power. It's right now, and we can't afford to wait.
Thank you. Those reflections really bring this full circle. As we see, a lot of the conversation was about infrastructure. So, and I love the fact that you referenced, Tony, that it's right now, and it's not necessarily telling young people that, eventually you'll get to that point that they can actually be involved now and they can contribute to civic society and help build that infrastructure. While volunteer time can be measured in some ways, its true value is seen in the lives that it touches, but also the communities that it strengthens. Please join me in thanking our panelists, and stay tuned for this afternoon's lineup. Thank you.